Hello, everybody. Welcome to Facts on the Ground. I'm Jesse Zerwell, and I'm pleased to welcome back today a former guest and friend of the show, George Szamuely. He's based in Hungary now, I believe, and he's written extensively on Kosovo, the Balkans, if you will, and that is what we're going to focus on today and try to make a through line from what happened there to what's currently happening in Palestine and what's happened in Palestine in the past as well. So, George, thank you for joining me again.
Good to be with you, Jesse.
So, I wanted to start with the history, or a brief history, if you will, of what happened in Bosnia in the early 90s.
Mm-hmm. Well, what happened was communism was collapsing throughout Eastern Europe, and then obviously it eventually spread to Yugoslavia. And so Yugoslavia, which consisted of 6 republics, and also when you looked at Serbia, Serbia also consists of Serbia proper, plus 2 autonomous provinces that were within Serbia, which was Kosovo and Vojvodina. What that happened at that stage is that the moment they held elections, and the elections held within each of the individual republics, the 6 republics, a number of them, particularly Croatia and Slovenia, moved almost immediately to seek independence. And they sought to do it unilaterally. In other words, they just basically were going to hold a referendum, a republic-wide referendum, not wait for any kind of a national referendum on whether the people of Yugoslavia wanted to keep the state of Yugoslavia going. They insisted, no, it has to be done nationally. And then once they got the results, they would just simply push ahead for independence. And this is, in fact, what happened. So the first elections in 1990, and then immediately Croatia and Slovenia pushed to have this referendum on independence. No real negotiations about the terms of exit or anything like that. Now, here the Western powers made a decisive intervention. While technically they were suggesting that well, we have no real dog in the fight. We don't really care whether the republics secede. That's an internal Yugoslav matter. However, if any force is used to prevent the secession, we will of course punish you. Well, of course, that already constricted the ability of the central government in Belgrade to do anything about the secession, because if they can move ahead with secession, and if they try to use force to prevent it, they will be punished for it. I mean, that was it's clearly a green light for the secessionists. And in addition to that, there were all sorts of noises coming from the European community. It was still called the European Community at that time. That if you secede from Yugoslavia, you will get favorable treatment from the Europe. There'll be this fast track towards entry into Yugoslavia. So what happened is that Croatia and Slovenia held their referendum, but the question that they asked in the referendum was almost completely meaningless. So in other words, they asked them, like, are you in favor of a sovereign and independent Croatia? Now, of course, when you ask a question like that, it's, what do you mean? The sovereign and independent within Yugoslavia, sovereign and independent outside of Yugoslavia? They deliberately left it vague. And of course, who's going to say they're against a sovereign and independent Croatia? So they got, a huge vote for it. And then boom, they right away said, we're going to declare independence. And there was a half-hearted attempt by the authorities in Yugoslavia to stop the secession of Slovenia, but because of the threats that were coming from Europe and the United States, that, my God, you're using force to prevent this secession, it was half-hearted. Croatia, they were very crafty, because what they did, there were Yugoslav troops stationed in Croatia. They knew perfectly well that Croatia couldn't possibly fight against the Yugoslav army. So what they did is they essentially blockaded the barracks. In other words, they cut off water, they cut off electricity, cut off gas, everything to the barracks, figuring that if the authorities in Belgrade tried to liberate these blockaded troops, or the blockaded troops tried to break out, then all this would be filmed in the Western media, and there would be the usual cries of, Yugoslavian army is using horrible force against the people seeking independence. So you then have to ask, why did the Western powers adopt this pose? And I think that they saw this as a historic opportunity, first of all, to rid communism of Europe altogether. So 1989, you have the communist governments in the Soviet bloc collapsing. Then there was still the problem of Yugoslavia, because Yugoslavia really wasn't part of the Soviet bloc. They had their own system. It was a distinctive system. It wasn't the Soviet imposed system. They had kind of what they call market socialism. And Tito, who was the longtime communist leader of Yugoslavia, did come to power. You obviously had Red Army help to come to power, but nonetheless, he had a falling out with the Soviet Union and managed to maintain his independence relative to the Soviet Union. So there was a fear that communism might survive in Yugoslavia. They might say, well, we've got a perfectly good system, well, it's not the Soviet system, and so therefore, why not stick with it? So that's one aspect of it. The other aspect of it was that the Western powers saw Yugoslavia as a potential ally of maybe a newly revitalized or Soviet Union. Soviet Union was still around at that time, but keep in mind, Serbia had always been seen as Russia's little brother. They're very similar people. They have a similar religion, the Eastern Orthodox Church. The language is quite close, and after all, Russia had even gone to war on behalf of Serbia in World War I, and indeed Russia had in many ways identified itself as the champion of the Christian peoples of the Balkans, as well as the Christian peoples in the Middle East, who had been persecuted by Islam, particularly the Turks. So there was a fear that Yugoslavia would be a festering sore. It would prevent a complete Western sweep of Eastern Europe, the Balkans, everything would be scooped up by the Western powers. So they wanted to get rid of Yugoslavia as quickly as possible. And that's why, from the beginning, when Croatia and Slovenia pushed for independence, for secession, the European Union, and in this case, chiefly Germany, made clear that they would be very supportive of any moves towards independence. And so when they did this in June the 25th, 1991, when they declared independence, Germany went right away, said, we're going to recognize this independence. And at that time, most of the European Union were very nervous about recognizing independence. In the first place, unilateral secession is clearly in violation of international law, and states really, really don't like recognizing unilateral secession, because they might be next on the chopping block. So it's a very, very tricky thing to do, to start recognizing any declarations of independence. So the Europeans didn't want to go through with it, but Germany was pushing forward, and that was at the time of the Maastricht Treaty, which kind of created that European monetary union, particularly the introduction of the euro, and Germany really was in a position to really push the rest of Europe to recognize it. And particularly the British, they gave the British an option to to opt out of the euro and out of the social charter, but then they demanded something in return, and that was that they would support German policy on recognizing Croatia and Slovenia. Then there was an intervention from the United Nations, because, of course, some of the people who knew a little bit about Yugoslavia, such as the UN Secretary General Perez de Cuellar, said, look, if you recognize Croatia and Slovenia, next would be Bosnia. And of course, the guy who was the leader of Bosnia, Alija Izetbegović, had already said that if Croatia and Slovenia leave Yugoslavia, and then Bosnia is next. And Bosnia was a very tricky one, because while Slovenia could say, okay, we're 100% Slovenians and that's it, Croatia, where something like 15-20% of the population were Serbs. And Croatia had been historically deemed constitutionally as the nation. Croatia was the nation of two, it comprised two constituent nations, the Serbs and the Croats. It was a creation of two constituent nations. Now, Bosnia was created by three constituent nations: the Serbs, the Croats, and the Muslims. I mean, the Muslims are very odd, because in Yugoslavia, the Muslims were deemed to be a nation. That was a kind of an innovation of Tito's. So the way it worked is that Begovic, who was a Muslim and leader of the Bosnian Muslims, the Muslims only comprised 43% of the population of Bosnia. The Serbs were about 36, 37%, and then the rest were Croats. So what then happened was Izetbegović said, yeah, I'm going to move forward with this. And he did it in alliance with the Croats against the Serbs. The Serbs said that they opposed the Serbs throughout Yugoslavia, opposed the secessions, because, of course, if there was to be a secession of the republics, the Serbs would find themselves as a minority in a number of the republics. And the Serbs had been the most populous nation in Yugoslavia, and they were the creators of Yugoslavia. I mean, that was the Kingdom of Serbia became the Kingdom of Yugoslavia after World War I. So the Serbs in Bosnia, just as the Serbs in Croatia, had strongly opposed the secession. But the point was that Germany did indeed go ahead and make clear that they were going to recognize the independence of Croatia and Slovenia, come what may. They were not going to be dissuaded from it. So the Europeans, realizing that they couldn't stop Germany from doing this, needed some kind of a fig leaf, as that they were going to recognize the secession of Croatia and Slovenia. So they had to come up with some rationale as to why are they recognizing unilateral secession. And they came up with something called the Badinter Commission. Robert Badinter was the head of the French Supreme Court. So they put together this commission comprising a number of heads of the Supreme Courts in Europe. I think the head of the German Constitutional Court was there. And so they put together, and they to come up with some verbal formula whereby they could recognize the breakaway republics of Yugoslavia without recognizing the right of secession. And so what they did is, Badinter did, is that he came up with this verbal formula by saying, well, Yugoslavia is a state in dissolution. Mm-hmm. So we're not recognizing secession, we're just recognizing reality. Yugoslavia is a state in dissolution. It was the worst kind of verbal trickery, the idea where you redefine terms and then you say, oh well, hey, we're not creating any precedents here. We're not recognizing unilateral secession. We're just saying it's it's a state in dissolution. And then that was one of Badinter's findings. And then Badinter said, okay, if you can have a referendum in all of the republics. If you get a referendum which says that we want to secede, then we, the Europeans, will recognize these independent states, and as long as you can, sign on the dotted line and say that you will recognize minority rights and whatnot, all these pieties that we Europeans subscribe to, everything will be fine. So that's what happened. So, Croatia and Slovenia, Germany recognized Croatia and Slovenia. The rest of the European, all the other European powers followed Germany's lead. And then Bosnia had a referendum. Now, the constitution of Bosnia, as I said, it was comprised three nations, three constituent nations. There could not be any attempt by two nations to gang up on a third. That was in the constitution. That was part of the constitution of Bosnia. You can't have two nations. I mean, the Croats supported the Muslims not because they particularly liked the Muslims, but they figured that once Bosnia leaves Yugoslavia, then the Bosnian Croats, their chunk of Bosnia would then join Croatia proper, and then it would be a kind of a nice big Croatia. So that's why the Bosnian Croats supported Izetbegović's Muslims, who said, okay, we also want to go for independence. Anyway, they had that referendum. The Serbs said, hey, you're violating Bosnia's constitution. We're going to boycott the referendum. So they boycotted the referendum. Bosnia declared independence. The Serb parts of Bosnia then declared independence from Bosnia. And that was how the war was started. It's important to remember that even at this late stage, because here we're talking now about 1992, this is April 1992, even at this late stage, there were attempts to prevent this inevitable war that was going to break out in Bosnia. So Milosevic himself, who was the president of Serbia, offered was the Belgrade Initiative, which would be a kind of a joint state between Serbia and Bosnia. Izetbegović wanted none of that. He refused to accept that. And then there was something called the Cutiliero Plan. And the Cutiliero Plan they said, okay, fine, we'll have an independent Bosnia. But it would be essentially a confederation of three nations, the Croats, the Muslims, and the Serbs. So that was still possibility. And it was the Cutiliero Plan that was agreed to in 1992 by Izetbegović, Mate Boban, who was the Bosnian Croat leader, and Radovan Karadzic was agreed to. And then Warren Zimmerman, the U.S. ambassador, former U.S. ambassador to Yugoslavia, went to Izetbegović and said, "Why sign this deal? You don't really like this," because Izetbegović didn't really like it. I mean, he wanted the whole state. Here, he was just going to get 1/3 of the state. So why sign this? And so Izetbegović, having first signed this agreement, then rescinded his signature, and that meant that was it. War was then absolute certainty. So you can see at each time you have these Western interventions that guaranteed the war. That moment when Izetbegović withdrew his signature for what was a last-ditch attempt to prevent a war, kind of creating a confederation within Bosnia, was just an act of complete irresponsibility. Anyway, so that's just roughly, the origins of it. So, and it's more complicated than that, but just a brief summary.
One of the things I wanted to ask you about that before we pivot to Palestine is the Islamist, however you wish to pronounce it, element of the war. And the late Robert Fisk has said that the first beheading videos he encountered were from the Bosnian War, if that's how you'd like to term it. So, and then after that, I'd like to talk a little bit about the Oslo Accords, because they were happening sort of around the same time. And again, we were seeing former imperial powers and the US imperial power interfere there to fragment. But can you talk about the Islamist element of that war? Because I think it's often overlooked.
I mean, we talked a little bit now about Alija Izetbegović. Izetbegović had, served in World War II in a kind of a Muslim battalion, a Nazi Muslim battalion. Because Muslims had actually supported the Nazis in World War II. I mean, did that in obviously in Palestine, but they also did that in Bosnia. He
Right.
served.
Haj Amin, who is the Grand Mufti of
Right, exactly.
Palestine, he met with
Right,
Hitler.
right. And he was, he himself was in, well, he was in Berlin, but then he was also in, he was in Bosnia too. So Izetbegovic, yeah, he served on the Nazi side in World War II. He was imprisoned after the war, following that. Then he was released, and then he was imprisoned again for Muslim activities, Islamist activities. And then he also wrote a book, is the Islamic Declaration, which was very much a call to arms, saying, you know, Islam cannot coexist with the non-Islamic world. He was an Islamist, and it's very, very important to remember that the Serbs had no problem dealing with Muslims. They had a serious problem dealing with Izetbegovic, and there's always been a kind of a mystery because they had these elections in 1990. And Izetbegovic didn't win the election on the Muslim side. So because each nation had its own elections. Izetbegovic came in second. The guy who won on the Muslim side was Fikret Abdic, who was a kind of a pragmatic, very wealthy businessman. There was some kind of a deal cooked up between Abdic and Izetbegovic, by which Abdic stepped down and Izetbegovic became president. Now, Fikret Abdic was someone that the Serbs actually dealt very well with, and in fact, they were allies with him during the war. But it was Izetbegovic was a problem because Izetbegovic was an Islamist. Now, in the West, this was covered up, and there was again a concerted attempt to dismiss all of the charges that the Serbs in particular made about Izetbegovic, much as the Westers tried to cover up the accusations against Ukrainian fascists and the various neo-Nazi elements in Ukraine, just as the Western media also covered up the sort of fascist roots of the Croatian independence movement. So, but yeah, I mean, in the case of the Bosnian Muslims, they really weren't very good fighters because they were pursuing a strategy of trying to get the West to intervene on their behalf. And the way they would get the West to intervene on their behalf was by staging horrific scenes whereby they say, we're the victims of Serb genocide. Please come in and help us. So that was really their strategy. That's why if you look at the record of the war, what's most notable were the three so-called breadline massacres, whereby it's the same square in Sarajevo was supposedly attacked by Serb mortars. And each time they attacked the Serb mortars, and lo and behold, 10, 20, 30, 50, 60 Muslims were killed who were lining up for bread. And this was each time the Serbs were accused of this. The Serbs always denied this. They said, no, we never launched this mortar. And the interesting thing is that the UN people on the ground never really bought into the story that that these people were massacred as a result of Serb mortars. They suspected that there were bombs planted here in order to kill their own people, and then scream, intervention, intervention, you must save us, you must save us, which incidentally worked, because that was really, I mean, you're probably too young, you don't remember those days, but there was a hysteria in the Western media, particularly in Germany, but Germany has a long history of animus toward the Serbs. So particularly in Germany, again, Austria has a long historical animus towards the Serbs. In the German-Austrian media, also in the case of the UK media, but particularly in the US media, which was the Serbs are committing horrific atrocities, eventually claimed genocide against the Muslims. NATO must act. NATO must step in and deal with the Serbs. So that was the Muslim strategy. Now, because they weren't very good fighters, they did bring in people who were pretty good fighters. They were good fighters only in the sense that they were so savage, so brutal that they kind of frightened everybody. You know, these were the head choppers, and there are many, many pictures on the internet of beheadings, and the kind of thing that we've seen elsewhere. You know, this is what we've seen in Syria.
Mhm.
These were the head choppers. These were the jihadis, and Izzet Begovic brought them in, and he brought them in with the help of the United States. And this is not something that this is just internet rumor. Read Richard Holbrooke's book, To End a War. And he says that openly that, we brought in these jihadis, but it was, it's the same as with Hitler and Stalin. We had to align ourselves with Stalin against Hitler. And so he says, so in other words, we aligned ourselves with the jihadis against the Serbs. So the Serbs were Hitler, and the jihadis were Stalin. That's in Richard Holbrooke's book. So this is a distinct policy that the U.S. pursued. The embarrassing part of it was that a couple of years after Holbrooke published his book, I think he published his book in 1998, I think, To End a War. Then you had the 9/11 attacks. So suddenly it was all very embarrassing because you find that the Americans suddenly found themselves at the receiving end of the jihadis. So all this had to be quickly wrapped up. And within days of 9/11, the pressure grew on Bosnia. Get rid of these jihadis, send them packing, send them home. And that's what the government in Bosnia had to do, because they knew that people were going to ask serious questions. What the hell has the United States been doing, aligning themselves with the worst scum in the world? So they were packed off home from Bosnia within days of 9/11. Again, all this is in the media. You could read articles in New York Times, Los Angeles, and how they were just shoving them on planes and getting them out, which again raises a very interesting question. What the hell were they doing in Sarajevo to begin with? Why were, this was in 2001. The war had ended, the Bosnian War anyway, had ended in 1995. 6 years later, these jihadis were all happily living still in Sarajevo. They were brought in by Izzet Begovic and the United States. So yeah, this was the kind of the strategy of the Bosnian Muslim. Very cynical, very cruel strategy, which incidentally, and goes into a bigger topic, kind of touches on what really happened in Srebrenica. The whole story of Srebrenica.
I wanted to ask you about that.
Right. Well, that's it. I mean, the story that the Serbs went ahead and took 8,000 Bosnian men, Muslim men and boys, and executed them, just is simply untrue. The Muslim fighters, and these were fighters. This wasn't a civilian town. These were fighters who were based in Srebrenica, had sought to escape. They saw that the Serbs, they were besieged by the Serbs. They sought escape. Now, what they did is that they sought escape, and they sought escape because their leaders had fled. Their leaders had been pulled out, so they were completely leaderless at that moment when they were surrounded by the Serbs. So they sought escape in broad daylight. Well, I mean, fighters retreating in broad daylight to get to their base, which they were going to Tuzla, their base. Well, they're legitimate military targets, and they were attacked by the Serb forces. Because there's no obligation on the part of any forces, to hold their fire in the face of a retreating army. This was a retreating army. They did it in broad daylight, so essentially they were sitting ducks for the Serb forces. There were some executions, and that it remains a kind of a mystery, and that's an interesting question. Who actually committed these executions? Because there's no evidence that anybody in the Bosnian army command ever ordered any executions. at what stage did Mladic order Ratko Mladic, who was the head of the Bosnian Serb forces? When did he order execution? No evidence. So, and there is evidence that various mercenaries were involved in these executions. Who paid these mercenaries? Where did they suddenly come from? And that is a very interesting question. But of course, no one really wants to get to the bottom of that. But even at the kind of phony court of the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, they heard evidence that there were mercenaries who were there and who performed these executions, but they never could find out who ordered these mercenaries to do these executions. That's why, you know, there has to be a suspicion that the whole purpose of these executions was then to create the situation for NATO intervention, which is what happened. I mean, this was in July 1995, and then in August 1995 there was the massive bombing of the Bosnian Serb positions by NATO. So that's it. So that was it. But that again, you can see that the strategy there was not to win this war. They knew that the Muslims made really no attempt to try to win the war against the Serbs. It was more to create this humanitarian disaster and to trigger Western intervention. And that, of course, kind of led to the whole humanitarian intervention, responsibility to protect, and all this stuff. So that, I mean, but that was very much the strategy that the Bosnian Muslims were waging in that war.
Yeah, and there are lots of echoes here, severe echoes with what we've seen happen in Syria. And as you mentioned earlier, there's a severe anti-communist motive behind this, if you will, by the Western powers. And it reminds me of what Zbigniew Brzezinski said when he wanted to create an arc of influence, I believe it was, because he was essentially obsessed with defeating the Soviet Union and was what you could call a violent anti-communist. So obviously what happened with that is the US hired and equipped and funded jihadist proxies. And we saw that they were left to their own devices once the Soviet Union collapsed. And then it became for the US a disposal problem. And these jihadis started migrating to other places like Bosnia, for example.
That's exactly right. That's what happened. Brzezinski, kind of, you know, he was a very clever man. He knew what he was doing in 1979. But first of all, there was clearly an attempt to provoke the Soviet Union to intervene in Afghanistan. I mean, it was the jihadis were being sponsored by the United States before the Soviet invasion. So it didn't come, in response to the Soviet invasion. It came before. It's, you know, written about by Robert Gates. It's not Richard Gates. Robert Gates was the head of the CIA. So Robert Gates wrote about this in one of his earlier books, that what they were doing in about 1978, the United States was already sponsoring jihadis in Afghanistan before the Soviet intervention, because they saw radical Islam as a way to undermine the Soviet Union. They saw this as this is the way to do it. And so, you know, in a way, they were trying to provoke a Soviet intervention in Afghanistan, which eventually came. And then they were hoping that they would use that because, as you know, there was an enormous number of Muslim people within the Soviet Union, and they thought this would be a great vulnerability for the Soviets, that if all these jihadi movements would start spreading within the Soviet Union. And Soviet leaders were very concerned about that. They were concerned about the Khomeini revolution in Iran. They were concerned about the sudden spike in radical Islam. I mean, they'd had to deal with that earlier on in the early days of the Bolshevik revolution, and now it looked like it was coming back. And that was Brzezinski's goal. Now, Brzezinski knew that this is a very dangerous game to play, because these were bad people. I mean, these were real crazies. And nonetheless, so he would send them all the arms they want. And of course, under Reagan, this became escalated. They're sending stingers to all these people, and as you say, I mean, once the Soviets pulled out of Afghanistan, well, what the hell are you going to do with all these people? And then became very useful to move them over into Bosnia. And we know Osama bin Laden was in Bosnia. I mean, this was there's a record of him. He was issued with a Bosnian passport. He spent time in Bosnia during those years, during the 1990s. It was written about. It was all of there were newspaper stories at the time about these charities that Osama bin Laden was running in Bosnia. At the time, of course, this was 1993, so people didn't know who exactly Osama bin Laden was, but they just he's running these Islamic charities. So there were all of these fronts, and the United States was more than happy with it, because it was all directed against the Serbs. Why were they against the Serbs? Even though the Serbs were their allies in 2 world wars, they were against them. They saw them as, first of all, potential allies of Russia, and they wanted to push Russia out of Europe once and for all, a kind of historic push against Russia, so they would, they'd be pushed, thousands of miles eastward, kind of several hundred years of history is going to be wiped out. So that was one thing. But also, the Serbs were led by Slobodan Milosevic, who the Americans identified as, if not a communist, as a socialist. He was someone who wasn't ready to go along with the neoliberal order in Eastern Europe. He wasn't interested in joining NATO. He wasn't interested in joining all these Atlantic partnerships. So they targeted him very early on as someone that they really wanted out. And that's why subsequently, because the Kosovo war started a few years after the Bosnian War, the goal of the Kosovo was really primarily to get Milosevic out. They started, try to incite the Kosovo Albanians with a view that they could either Milosevic would surrender to their demands for independence, in which case the Serbs would get rid of Milosevic as a traitor, or if Milosevic used force against these Kosovo Albanian insurgents, then this would justify a NATO humanitarian intervention. And that was why the Americans and the Germans together, the British were also involved, began this insurrection or insurgency within Kosovo, starting in around 1998. Again, they fought very poorly. They lost all their battles, but the Western media were on hand to point, oh my God, the horror, the shock, the humanitarian crisis, the Serbs are committing terrible atrocities. We've got to do something, The Serbs are such terrible people. That was the goal.
I remember I was 16. I was about 16 at the time. And because I was studying for my SATs, I got, of all things, a free subscription to Time magazine for all my sins, I guess. Mm-hmm. And I remember reading about what was happening, and all the pictures were of what looked like Serb militiamen with shaved heads, walking around armed and in army garb. And that was the only picture we were getting. And of course, back then, I wasn't too quick on the uptake with what was happening there. But looking back, I can see the Western narrative control so clearly, and that's what enabled to happen what happened, which is essentially NATO committed war crimes.
That's right. And what's interesting, and that goes back to how the Western media presented the wars in Yugoslavia, was that it's actually Serbia that had the most open and diverse society, non-nationalist society. And it's the Croats in particular who ran a very narrow nationalistic society. So they all talk about Serb nationalism, Serb nationalism. Serbia was the least nationalistic of any of the successor states of Yugoslavia, largely because it was run by Milosevic. Milosevic was not a nationalist. Milosevic was still part of the Titoist tradition. But the media presented about Serb nationalism, but he wasn't. And so the Croatian, the first thing the Croatians did, other than calling for a referendum on independence, was to change the constitution from the Croatia is not the creation of the Serbian and Croatian people, but just say Croatia was the creation of the Croatian people. And the Serbs were kicked out and it just became a minority within Croatia. That was the first thing. It's a little like the Ukrainians, people who took over after they overthrew Yanukovych. What's the first thing they do? They push against the use of Russian as an official language. Right? You got no other priorities but other than the kind of this very nationalistic one. And so the same thing goes for the Kosovo Albanians. These were extraordinarily narrow-minded people, very intolerant, very primitive. You want patriarchy, that's patriarchy. You want tribalism. Then you got tribalism. But not how the West wanted to present. They wanted to present the Serbs as being very primitive, which of course they weren't. But that's. There was another part of it is that the Kosovo Albanians decided that they would boycott the Serbian institution. Again, so they said, we'll boycott all the Serbian institutions. Well, the Serbian institutions were pretty good, particularly the healthcare system was actually pretty good. Again, it's a legacy of the communist era. So the Albanians, of course, once they started boycotting the Serbian health institutions, they had their own makeshift clinics, which of course were lousy. Western media would say, oh my God, they've been persecuted by the Serbs. Look at these terrible clinics. These are makeshift terrible clinics. This is humiliating. This is a humanitarian disaster. This was a creation of the Kosovo Albanian narrow nationalist agenda by which they chose to boycott the Serbian institutions, which were pretty good. But again, it was the way it was misinterpreted. So when you say, "Oh, the Serb militiamen," yeah, these were people who were there was a proper army. Now,
I'm not saying that's what they were, but that's how it was presented.
No, I know. I understood exactly what you meant. That's the way the media were presenting it at the time. But complete falsehood, total falsehood, exact opposite of the truth. In other words, they presented the Kosovo Albanians, which is, and look at the state now. This is the state which unilaterally declared independence, and which again the Western powers rushed to recognize, even though it's in violation of the UN Security Council resolution, in violation of international law. They rushed to recognize it, but it's an absolute cesspool. It has the highest crime rate in Europe. We know all the stories that have come out about the organ harvesting and everything else. That's the creation. That's the state that the West created.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, you had a good, decent, functioning state of Yugoslavia, and you created this criminal cesspool of Kosovo. And the West would say, okay, great, but we've got a nice big military base, Camp Bondsteel, in Kosovo. So, we're good. What the hell do we care? People don't live well. Not our problem. We're okay. So that's kind of shows the cynicism of the Western attitude, Western humanitarian intervention.
Right. Humanitarian in quotes. So I still do want to get to Palestine and the accords that were made, the Oslo Accords, for example, and then Camp David, and the way these were essentially Western manufactured meetings, if you will, or negotiations to have more negotiations, as I've said before. But one thing I wanted to ask you about before that is Srebrenica and the, I suppose, trials for war crimes and crimes against humanity we've seen against Radovan Karadzic and the claims that have been made against Ratko Mladic. I'm asking because before this conversation, I've always had the notion, or I've always subscribed to the notion that there was a genocide, and I believe the numbers as well. And I saw a documentary, I forget what it's called exactly. It's Srebrenica Screaming from the Void, something like that. And you may have seen it. And in it, there's footage, I believe it's of Ratko Mladic. They're entering a Muslim town, an ostensibly Muslim town, and he's telling his soldiers to take the street signs down and replace them with Serbian street signs, I suppose. And then there's also footage of what who are supposedly Serbian soldiers yelling for the people we were talking about earlier, those who were hiding in the woods in broad daylight, yelling for them to come out. And it's presented as if they're civilians. So I'm wondering if you can just clear that up. And then we can get to Palestine, because I think one of the overarching themes here is narrative control. And I'm wondering if you can speak to that documentary or just that narrative a little bit more.
You know, the thing about Srebrenica was that there'd been a protracted struggle for control of Srebrenica. So what had happened was that the Muslims had driven the Serbs out of Srebrenica, and now it had become a Muslim town. Now, what then happened was that the United Nations Security Council created what are called safe areas. With safe areas, it sounds like, oh, great, we have some civilian areas, and so the safe areas included Srebrenica, Žepa, Tuzla, Sarajevo, Bihać, and something.
Gorodnik?
No,
I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right.
No, and I would Gorazde. So yeah, Gorazde, Bihać, Srebrenica, Žepa, Tuzla, and Sarajevo. So, but the point is that these were not civilian. These are not agglomerations of civilians. To the contrary, they were the base of the Bosnian Muslim army. Now, what was particularly bad in the case of Srebrenica was that the person who was there, who led the forces that were based in Srebrenica, this was Nasser Oric, and he was the head of this their 82nd division. He was responsible for some horrific atrocities against Serbs. So
I believe if you go on YouTube, you can find videos of him where he's hailed as a national hero of sorts.
Right. Yeah. I mean, Muslims. I mean, yeah, that's right. Among Muslims, he was regarded, as a national hero. But he was responsible for one of the worst atrocities in the war in the Christmas of 1992. The sort of in Kravic, he committed massacres. So in any ways, they were here in Srebrenica, and there was a moment in 1993 when the Serbs wanted to take back Srebrenica, and then Milosevic pressed upon Karadzic and says, don't take Srebrenica because there is such hatred among the Serbs towards Nasser Oric that there might well be a bloodbath if they take Srebrenica. So Milosevic said this to Karadzic, and Karadzic turned and said, okay, we won't take Srebrenica. This was in 1993. And then they made this, they declared, this was April 1993, they declared Srebrenica a safe area, so therefore no one could take it. But during this time, from 1993 on to 1995, where the, Oric used his forces to attack, neighboring Serb villages. So this was a real problem for the Serbs because there's a war going on. The war was particularly focused on Sarajevo, so who would control Sarajevo, and the Serbs were continually distracted by having to deal with these attacks emanating from Srebrenica. And so the Serbs then decided that they really needed to take Srebrenica. But there was also a question of the final settlement. I mean, the problem with these safe areas is that they were preventing, and that was really the goal, the real goal all along, they were preventing essentially a partition along somehow on national ethnic lines. So you'd have some sense where here's a cohesive Serb entity, here's a cohesive Muslim entity. But Srebrenica and Žepa were right slap bang in the middle of essentially Serb areas. And so there was a real pain. And so therefore there was a military decision taken, but partly to create a kind of a cohesive Serb entity in the east of Bosnia, but also to essentially help the Serb war effort, which was primarily focused on Sarajevo, so to end these distractions. So, and this is where it gets very interesting, the Izetbegovic withdrew Oric from Srebrenica. And when Oric left, of course, his forces, their morale collapsed, and they were surrounded by Serbs. They didn't know what to do, and they began their retreat. And as I said earlier, they retreated in broad daylight, and of course, they are a military target. It was a catastrophic retreat. But when you're talking about this, they're calling out in the woods. There is no obligation on the part of any forces not to shoot other soldiers. I mean, if you surrender, you surrender, and then you're a prisoner of war, and then there are all kinds of the Geneva Conventions that guarantee the rights of prisoners of war. But if you haven't surrendered your arms, then you are a legitimate military target. So the point is that there really isn't that evidence of any concerted attempt to execute civilians. So when Mladic, when he entered Srebrenica and he met the town leaders, he said, if you want to stay in Srebrenica, you can stay in Srebrenica. If you want to leave Srebrenica, we will provide buses for you to leave. And many of the townspeople who were left, remember, the townspeople had been abandoned. This Muslim military, this brave Muslim military has essentially abandoned the women and children and the old men to their own devices.
And I think it's important to make a distinction there between the Muslim military forces or factions, however you want to brand them, and the civilians who were caught in between. Because I wanted to ask you about, I think it was at the Srebrenica safe zone when the UN Dutch bot, I believe it was, essentially gave up and allowed Serb forces to, this is the narrative I know, and I'm hoping you can correct it. And I know I mentioned getting to Palestine a number of times, and I don't know if we're going to have time to do that. So maybe we can do that in another episode, but I think these are important points to hit on right now. So I'm wondering if you can talk about that a little. And just one interesting tidbit I wanted to add related to that is that supposedly the Dutch bot commander was served at some point in Lebanon and was detained on the roadside and forced to lie down in humiliation, I believe by Hezbollah. I don't know if it was Hezbollah, but Robert Fisk actually wrote a piece about this, and the entire piece is he's convinced at least that a genocide did happen in Srebrenica, and that part of why this Dutch bot commander let these people be taken away is because of that humiliation and sort of, I guess,
Fisk,
lingering hatred of Muslims.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
I don't know how true.
Fisk is a very unreliable observer of these things. He saw everything from the perspective of the Middle East. And so he saw the Muslims as victims and subject to atrocities. He completely misread Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia is not at all like the Middle East. The Muslims played a very different role in East and Central Europe as they do in the Arab world. In East and Central Europe, the Muslims were the overlords. They were the people who had been the rulers in the era of the Turks, in the era of the Ottomans. So they were the top dogs. So the resentment that was directed toward them was a resentment because essentially they had sold out. They had converted to Islam in order to enjoy the favor of the Ottoman rulers. So it was a very different dynamic, and Fisk was basically got completely wrong. He got Kosovo completely wrong. He got Bosnia completely wrong. And for him to say that there was some sort of a genocide in Bosnia, based on what? The International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia has only ever convicted for genocide on the basis of Srebrenica. They tried various things. Well, this was, maybe in Žepa there was genocide, but they never really made that stick. The only claim for genocide, and they have convicted many people on genocide, but it always pertains to Srebrenica. And there, the evidence for genocide is non-existent. How can you have a genocide when you're talking about one town? So, even if you were to say, oh, they killed all the men in the town, which of course they didn't even remotely come, how does that get to be genocide? I mean, if you really wanted to commit genocide, you would kill all the women. Women are much more important to the reproduction of the species that a people would go on existing than men. I mean, it made no sense. So that's why this ICTY had to come up with all sorts of convoluted explanations as to why executing men in Srebrenica constituted genocide. Like you have genocide in one town. It's a complete violation of what the Genocide Convention was supposed to be about, which is a deliberate annihilation of a nation or a people. Well, there's no evidence for any of that. As I said, Mladic goes into Srebrenica and says to the townspeople, do you want to stay? You're welcome to stay. Or do you want to go? If you want to go, we will lay on buses for you. And that's what they did. Most of them decided that they wanted to go. And they laid on the buses, and they were bussed out of Srebrenica. But if he wanted to commit genocide, why didn't he do it? Why didn't he sort of order the massacre of the women and children? That's what you do if you have one genocide. He didn't do that. He offered them, said, "You want to stay?" And it's there. There are recordings of his meetings at the was it the Fontainebleau Hotel Fontana. You can actually see it's on YouTube. The meetings at the Hotel Fontana, which is the day after the Serbs took Srebrenica, and he offers the town leaders, you can either stay or you can go. And so therefore the whole genocide thing was this convoluted thing. Oh, they executed the prisoners. Well, in the first place, the numbers never added up. They could never come up with the 8,000 Muslim men who were executed. They basically they had to dig around the whole countryside, digging up bodies everywhere and saying, "Ah, yeah, that's another victim of Srebrenica." So they could never do that. But even if it were true, it still wouldn't constitute any sort of genocide, and that's why the reasoning behind it was somehow, well, because the something like the logic was somehow, well, because the women were not really sure what happened to the men folk, they would not be able to marry and therefore to reproduce. I mean, it's a completely nonsensical piece of reasoning, which they had to come up with because they already had that narrative of genocide, that they had to find genocide, but then they had to find some reason to justify. Just like I was talking earlier about Badinter. Badinter knew he had to come up with a reason to recognize the independence of the seceding republics of Yugoslavia. So he had to come up with some convoluted reasoning to justify it. So it was the same thing at the ICTY. But Fisk, people like that who just say, "Oh, I mean, how can somebody like that who doesn't believe the Western narrative when it comes to the Middle East, why would he suddenly believe it when it comes to Bosnia?" I mean, but you come across this all the time, on the sort of liberal and left. Well, we don't really buy into Western media narratives. Yeah, but you buy into the nonsense about Kosovo. You buy into the nonsense about the evil Serbs and Bosnia. That you buy into. You think George W. Bush is telling you the truth about that? Clinton is telling you the truth about that. Madeleine Albright, the ones who, was it the 500,000 Iraqi children? She's suddenly telling you the truth about Kosovo. I mean, but that's the mentality, unfortunately, of many on the sort of the liberals on the left. And you bring up Robert Fisk. I mean, that's a very good example.
Yeah, and I think that also speaks to the narrative control we were talking about earlier, because it doesn't just apply to mainstream media or independent media. Even it applies to somebody like Robert Fisk, who was an intelligent man, and I think with regard to the Middle East had quite a spot on perspective. But it was a form of narrative control on his part, with his books especially, and some of the pieces he put out, but always seeing things from the Muslim point of view. Yep. As if they're the only people who are victimized, not just in the Middle East, but in the Balkans as well. And that's not to say they aren't in huge numbers, but that
had nothing to do with the war in Bosnia. I mean, I gave a very short sort of précis of what happened there. I mean, here you had the Muslims who had been offered, I think, quite generous terms in the Belgrade Initiative by Milosevic, and then in the Kutiljero plan, a Bosnian confederation, and Izetbegovic gave up on it. I mean, because he felt that he could get the whole pie, he would get the whole country, and the United States would come in on his behalf. I mean, it's a mentality that keeps repeating itself. Oh, I can hold out for more because the Americans are going to come in and help out. I mean, you see a little bit of that in the case of Zelensky in Ukraine, and that was the strategy. But to suggest that the Muslims were the victims, I mean, they weren't the victims. I mean, the victims of that war were in large part the Serbs. The Serbs were the most populous nation in Yugoslavia. They were very anxious not to allow the common state to break up, because they would suddenly find themselves in minorities in all the different republics, some of whom had been extremely hostile to the Serbs, particularly Croatia and Bosnia. They'd been aligned with Hitler in World War II. There was genocide against the Serbs in Croatia, in Jasenovac. So the Serbs were not at all happy about finding themselves in minorities in these states. And remember, at that time, for many people who were living in the Balkans, World War II was a living memory. Now, we're now 25 years on, and of course, there aren't that many people for whom World War II is a living memory. But at that time, many people and their parents all had living memories of World War II. So they knew about Jasenovac. They knew about that the Croats and the Muslims had been aligned with Hitler. And now they were being told, oh, you're going to be a minority within these states. So, that for Fisk and for others to just insist, oh, these people were just the victims and these terrible Serbs. And I think Fisk just saw like, oh, the Serbs are just like the Israelis. That was it. He just saw, they're the Israelis. The Muslims are the Palestinians, and that's the equation. So I just think that and there was so much of that kind of thinking, that oh well, the Serbs, they're the sort of white colonialists. So I'm on the side of the Muslims. They must be the good guys. They must be the victims, the indigenous people. No, absolutely not. And so it's unfortunate that much of the liberal left got Yugoslavia completely wrong and still get it completely wrong.
Yeah, speaking of still getting it completely wrong, Chris Hedges, whom I have much respect for, he gets it wrong.
Yeah, I mean, he was terrible. Yeah, just awful. Kind of completely emotional, hysterical, and it's just it's just his stuff, the stuff that he was writing. He was at the New York Times at the time, and was just awful stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and on his show on Contact on RT, which I'm sure you're familiar with, which isn't a bad show, but he seems to have a compulsion to constantly refer to these Serb military leaders, Serb government leaders, and everyone he brings up is a genocidal monster. And
it's so awful. It's just it's quite nauseating. I mean, I took part in a one of the, maybe you took part of some reports that vigils for Julian Assange, Unity for Jay. I think it was about 2-3 years ago, and on one of those shows I was on with Hedges, and he was going on blathering on about Milosevic at that show. I mean, it was very hard for me to restrain myself. I thought, okay, it's not really about me. It's not it's about Julian Assange, but I was really having difficulties just controlling myself, so I just sort of opted out because I didn't want to get into a whole argument about Bosnia and Serbia when we're supposed to be talking about Julian Assange. But he was going on. It had no relevance to anything, and it was still going on about Milosevic. I mean, it was just embarrassing. It was childish, his performance.
Yeah, I think his default method when it comes to that is, at least with regard to Assange, is that what the Serbs supposedly try to do with erasure of the Muslim population is similar to what the US and UK governments are trying to do with erasing Julian Assange and WikiLeaks, which is, I think, a fatuous comparison. But
yeah, I mean, there's this kind of shallowness that you get at the New York Times. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what kind of erasure? I mean, Srebrenica, had a Muslim mayor, just a couple of years ago. The mayor was a Muslim. I mean, it was, there are Muslims living, happily in Srebrenica. What erasure is he talking about?
Mm-hmm.
The Izetbegovic, the Muslim, and as I say, we don't want to talk about Bosnian Muslims as a whole. It was the Izetbegovic who led the Muslims during that time. And again, he was not even a legitimate ruler. He was only supposed to be president for 1 year. It was supposed to be a rotating presidency. But anyway, Izetbegovic insisted on a unitary state, which was a non-starter. There was just no way that you could create a unitary state in Bosnia. And the reason the war ended was essentially, it was a reality. I mean, the Clinton administration, I think, realized belatedly that you would have to create essentially a federal system.
I'm glad you bring up the Clintons, because I know you're pressed for time, but that is something I want to hit on, because they were involved essentially from the beginning. And we all know about the video from 1996 in which Hillary Clinton claims to be under fire, sniper fire. And then in the video, she's walking up to people, a crowd of people who are waiting for her at the airport with her daughter, and she's smiling and giving out platitudes and pretending like she cares about any of what's going on. And then we had Clinton involved in 1999. And there's something I wanted to point out, which I found doing some research on this, is it's an Encyclopedia Britannica article. And I was looking up the Dayton Accords, which occurred in 1995 and were essentially the official end of the war. And the piece in Encyclopedia Britannica, and I don't know what the ethics are regarding this, but it's written by Bill Clinton.
Yes. Yeah, I don't know what the ethics of that either are. Yeah, no, that's it. Look, they essentially had to recognize the reality that the unitary state that the Clinton administration had insisted on wasn't going to happen. So they keep saying, you know, again, the media say, whoa, you know, NATO bombed Bosnia and the Serbs, and you know, it showed their muscle, and the Serbs caved, and then we got the Dayton Accords. No, the Dayton Accords were acknowledgement of the reality. If that reality had been acknowledged in 1992 at the time of the Cutiliero plan, well, it could have, you know, the war could have been avoided. That's it. I mean, it was pretty much like the Cutiliero plan. It goes back to what you had in 1992. You had to recognize that you couldn't create a unitary state. And all of the other nonsense that the Clinton administration had wanted, like the contact group plan, were non-starters. You couldn't, you know, you can't force people to live in states that they don't accept. You know, I suppose the United States could have invaded Bosnia and tried to force some kind of a state on the people there, but no one was going to do it. No one was going to buy into that.
Mm-hmm.
So it was that's why the war came to an end. And as you know, another thing was that the Serbs had now, they took Srebrenica, they took Žepa, and now you were able to have a contiguous area which was Serb, where before, you know, with these enclaves, these armed enclaves, you know, it basically was preventing any resolution of the conflict. But again, the media want to present it as somehow, well, the United States got tough and the Serbs caved. No, this was the deal that was always available earlier on. There was the Cutiliero plan in 1992, and the what's called the Owen-Stoltenberg peace plan of 1993. Again, each of these plans, the Clinton administration said, "Oh no, we don't want, you know, you're rewarding the Serbs, you're rewarding ethnic cleansing. Oh, it's too generous to the Serbs, you're too generous to the Serbs." But in the end, you know, that's what the Clinton administration accepted. I think Clinton was worried about his re-election, and he wanted to wrap it up. He didn't want the war to drag on. But essentially, the Clinton administration kept this war going by objecting to all the peace plans that had been put forward, by saying, "Oh, it's too generous to the Serbs. You're rewarding the Serbs." Well, you know, and then you have to accept reality. I mean, it's not unlike what happened in Kosovo. I mean, you know, NATO and the Clinton administration were kind of rejoicing. "Oh, we showed the Serbs what's what." Well, no. I mean, you know, you basically, if the United States had stuck to what was agreed on, which was at the UN Security Council Resolution 1244, then the Serbs would have achieved what was always attainable before the NATO bombing, which was to recognize Kosovo as an integral part of Serbia, to have essentially a United Nations force in Kosovo, and not a NATO force, and that the administration would be run by the United Nations. Now, of course, that's in the resolution 1244, but of course, as often happens, the Americans immediately ignored all of that. Kosovo was encouraged to secede, and that was a resolution. Another part of the resolution was that the Serb religious institutions in Kosovo, all the monasteries and churches and everything, the Serbs would still have access to all that. So that's written in the resolution. Of course, no access. So yeah, I mean, as often happens, any agreement, the United States signs on to, it's not worth the paper it's written on. But yeah, I mean, the story that somehow, we got everything we wanted, we showed Milosevic who's boss. No, this is, NATO had to climb down from its demands that it had made beforehand. I mean, I don't know if you probably don't remember, the key point was NATO would have unconditional rights within Serbia proper. They would move around with Serbia, unhindered. That's that famous Appendix B, which was in the Rambouillet Accords, which the Serbs absolutely refused.
Which is flat out imperialism.
That was never, the Serbs insisted that was not be in the UN resolution, and it's not in the UN resolution. There are no NATO forces in Serbia. So Albright, who wanted this, she didn't get it. Albright would say that the force that would occupy Kosovo would be a NATO force, also not in the UN resolution. So you bombed and bombed and bombed and achieved what? I mean, so the same goes in Bosnia. You got what you could have had in 1992.
Yeah, and just quickly speaking of the bombing, I still believe that under Clinton's watch, it's the longest sustained bombing, the bombing of Yugoslavia since World War II, if I'm not mistaken.
No one had done this. No one had bombed European cities since Hitler. That's the glory of NATO, that no one had actually done this since Hitler. Bombing of cities. I mean, you could say the Soviets occupied Hungary in 56 or Czechoslovakia in 68, but that was still essentially the status quo. I mean, that was just simply, the winnings of World War II. You basically were, the Russians weren't going to let go of any of that. But in terms of sending in your aircraft and bombing ancient European cities, no one had done that since Hitler. So that's NATO's stupendous achievement. And you're right, it was an 11-week bombing campaign, but they made sure to bomb extra hard on Orthodox Easter. There's a kind of nice sadistic element to it. So
right,
on the day of Orthodox Easter, you bomb extra hard.
Right. And they have the gall to label this as strictly in ethno-religious conflict when NATO, as you said, chooses to bomb on ethno-religious terms, if you will.
Yeah. That's exactly right. I mean, it's and throughout, they continued to keeping this going, and on behalf of essentially the worst elements, which is the Kosovo Liberation Army, which, as I said earlier, were terrible fighters. I mean, they were no match at all for the Yugoslav army. They were easily defeated. But the whole point was to create these images of humanitarian disasters, which would then, with the mindless media, would whip up further. Oh my God, horrible things are happening. I mean, the classic example of that was the Račak quote massacre unquote, which was entirely staged. There had been a fight between the Yugoslav army and the Kosovo Liberation Army. And again, the Yugoslav army won comfortably. So the number of the soldiers, the KLA soldiers, were killed. KLA, arranged the bodies in such a way that on the next day, the William Walker, one of these awful kind of American hatchet men, had been ambassador, I think it was El Salvador. He had been ambassador to El Salvador during the height of the wars in the 1980s. He was there to show, oh my God, this is a massacre. This is absolutely horrible. This is the worst thing I've ever seen in my life. But it was all staged. They moved the bodies around to make it seem that the people had been executed. Complete and utter nonsense. But Ratchak kind of then triggered the Rambouillet talks, because then the Serbs are threatened. You better show up to Rambouillet or else we bomb. And then Rambouillet was essentially a setup in order to present the Serbs with a peace plan that was so outrageous, such a humiliation, that they would be forced to reject. And then once they rejected it, then NATO has the excuse to bomb the Serbs. And that's exactly what happened. Rambouillet was just an utter fraud. But the lead up to it was this other fraud, which was Ratchak. I mean, this really was the most bogus war ever. I mean, it puts to shame the whole thing about everyone goes on about Iraq and the weapons of mass destruction, but this was far worse.
Yeah, and I think it's important that we talk about this, not just in relation to Palestine, but Iraq, as you said, and Syria as well. So many echoes of Syria and what supposedly happened with the non-existent chemical weapons attack, which and the aftermath, the OPCW aftermath. And I think in the context of the Balkans, it's part of this seemingly never-ending series on the part of the West to sponsor certain contras in certain countries and, again, control the narrative and try to make it seem like the aggressors are the victims. We see this in Palestine. We see this in Syria. Assad is the worst human being on the planet, in other countries as well. So I think that's, even though we didn't get to Palestine, and hopefully we can have another discussion.
Let's talk about it next time.
Yeah. So the last thing I wanted to ask you is, often people who take the position that you do with regard to what happened in Bosnia and in Kosovo are reflexively slandered as possible racists.
Yeah.
Or I'm not going to say possible. I think everybody has a stripe of or a thread of racism in them. The point is to work to be anti-racist. But point being, that's often the smear that's leveled at people who take your position. And I think you've just presented a very cogent and historically, very well historically referenced case. So what is your response to that when people, I don't know if you've ever received that criticism, but I've heard it before. So,
well, I think so. I mean, I think that, racist is now the go-to insult. Anytime you want to say something derogatory about your political opponents, you say they're racist. So racist is now thrown around. Well, it was about the Serbs, and then of course about the Russians. And as I mentioned, the Serbs are the least racist. I mean, their constitution, the constitution that was promulgated by Milosevic after 1990, was one in which it was a classic kind of liberal constitution. It didn't say, "Oh, Serbia is the fate of the Serbian people." It was, the way that the constitutions are, which is that basically you belong to the Serbian nation as you fulfill the criteria of the constitution. So it was not in any way a kind of a national ethnic basis of Serbian nationhood. It was a liberal constitution. It was very unlike as I say, the constitution of Croatia, which said specifically Croatia is the state of the Croatian people. In other words, you have to be a member of the Croatian nation to be a citizen of Croatia.
A
But
bit
that was
like
they
Israel has determined that it's
right.
unilaterally determined that it's a Jewish state.
Right, exactly. That's it. Yeah, and that's a good example because, of course, then what about the non-Jews who are living in Israel? So they evidently are not, members of that state. So no, that's exactly right. And so, uh, but they needed to keep that story going. And as you mentioned, like Chris Hedges, who keeps spreading the story. He goes there and whatever show he's on, he tells this story, which is an absolute baloney, complete opposite of the truth. Milosevic himself had belonged to the Titoist tradition, and Serbia was the most ethnically diverse nation among the successors states of Yugoslavia. It has a very large Muslim population. There was never any repression of languages or any such thing. But and the same goes with Russia. I mean, Russia is an extremely diverse country. In terms of the nationalities who live there, in terms of the religious affiliation of the people there. But they keep putting this, oh, Russia is also racist. In the meantime, you have Nazis marching in Kiev,
Yeah.
looking back nostalgic to the good old days of collaborating with Hitler. That is ignored, and they still keep putting forward this ridiculous story about Putin. Is the there's a great case of that is particularly in the Guardian. The Guardian is one of the worst in this, and I forgot one of the Guardian reporters who claimed, I think it was during the time of the World Cup, which was 2018, that he visited this bar in Russia, and the people in the bar were singing Nazi songs.
Mm-hmm.
The Russians were singing Nazi songs. But what a shame that he didn't make a recording. Damn, you must have left your phone at home that you were unable to make the recording. This is so ridiculous. I mean, the whole idea that anyone in Russia would sing Nazi songs, it's nuts. But they keep putting out these stories to suggest that, the Russians are Nazis. It is the exact opposite. I mean,
as far as I remember, they fought the Nazis.
That's as far as I remember. They're the ones who go every year, to condemn before the United Nations General Assembly to condemn fascism, and those who would seek to revive fascism, and those who would seek to rewrite the outcome of World War II. And every year, the United States and Ukraine always vote against this Russian-sponsored resolution. So the whole idea that anybody in Russia would sing Nazi songs in a bar is so ridiculous. And again, you couldn't record it. I mean, this is quite an event. You're a journalist. You forgot. You left your telephone at home. You left your laptop at home. I mean, but that's
it sounds like Luke Harding. I don't know if you're familiar with him.
Yeah, no, it wasn't Luke Harding. Because Harding wasn't. Harding had been based in Moscow, but this was after Harding. So this is 2018. I mean, the name will come to me, but I can't remember. But it's one of the reporters. I mean, he's the same reporter who then, I think in 2014, claimed that Russia had invaded Ukraine, and he said he saw it with his own eyes, Russian tanks crossing the border. But damn, left my camera at home. I mean, God damn it, and my phone, my phone was at home as well. Amazing. You got these scoops. If only you brought your phone with you. Damn. Well, next time.
Yeah, and I think that what you have on your side is the historical facts, and when you put forth your argument, if people have their predispositions toward what you're saying, then they're probably going to go with that and try to pillory your argument despite the facts.
Well, I think people do that. I mean, they say, you remember people who were against the Iraq War, who were strongly urging Bush not to invade Iraq, were called Saddam apologists. The Saddamites. They were the ones. Just like now, people who don't want or against sanctions against Syria, who don't want American military intervention against Syria. Oh, they're Assad apologists.
Yeah.
So you have that at the time in the 1990s, Yugoslavia. Oh, you're an apologist for Milosevic. I mean, it's a mindless thing. Oh, you're an apologist for genocide.
Right.
And this is all the time, the genocide denialists. So there's a whole profession of these journalists who go around accusing me and others, oh, they're genocide denialists, so it's just like, Holocaust denialists, they refuse to accept that there was genocide in Bosnia. And then, they usually put forward these lists of people, Noam Chomsky, Edward Herman, and others, they're genocide denialists.
Right.
So, that's the way these insults operate. Of course, you call somebody a genocide denialist, it's like saying you're a Holocaust denialist. Well, who's going?
What can you say in return besides
exactly.
No, I'm not?
Exactly. What civilized person is going to talk to a Holocaust denialist? And that's the whole point. Is just to remove you from any kind of civilized discourse.
Right. And we're still seeing it today. It was a few years ago now, I believe, but James Clapper, the former head of the NSA, I believe it was,
he was head.
Was it DIA?
No, he was the head of the ODNI, the Director of National Intelligence.
Okay.
He was head of the whole intelligence apparatus in the U.S.
And we all remember him lying to Congress about surveillance here. And during, I guess, the buildup, or maybe almost close to the apex of the Russiagate nonsense here, he was on, I forget who he contributes to, if it's MSNBC or CNN, but he was on one of those being asked about Russiagate, and he literally said out loud that he believes that Russians have a genetic predisposition for meddling and interference,
deceit and dissimulation. Yeah,
and that's racist right there.
It sure is. But that's the thing. I mean, it's permissible to say the most racist things about Russians. And before that, it used to be the same about Serbs. You were just saying something. You could say anything.
Right.
Little savages. Serb. At the time, you can dig up. People who were writing things. Oh, all Serbs must be put in a re-education camp. Biden himself said that about the Serbs. Serbs need to be put in a re-education camp. He was one of the worst Serbophobes at the time. They all need to be put in this in a re-education camp, for years and years before they can become civilized people. He called them all murderers, thugs, scum. I mean, that's how he described Serbs. That is that again. You can look this up on YouTube. You can find Biden saying these things about Serbs.
Right. And now we're seeing Biden's administration move harder and harder against China, as if Biden still thinks Mao is still in power. And they're this huge communist threat. It goes back to the anti-communism that we began with. And so it remains to be seen what's going to happen under Biden with both Russia and China, because it seems like they're not only continuing Trump's stance, which is another discussion, but they are ramping it up. So, George, thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you, Jesse. I as always, greatly enjoyed it.
Yeah, I did too. And hopefully we can get an episode up soon that ties this as much as we can to Palestine. And thank you again for coming on. Our guest today has been George Szamuely. He is how would you describe it? A
Well, yeah, I say
researcher?
yeah, I'm the author of Bombs for Peace, NATO as well. I mean, actually, I can show. Maybe I can show the book so that
Yeah,
people might actually
absolutely.
buy the book.
Yeah,
Unfortunately,
go
rather
for it.
expensive, but this is the book to buy. Bombs for Peace: NATO's Humanitarian War on Yugoslavia. And some of the topics that we covered today, I obviously go into much greater length in that book. It's available on Amazon, so go to Amazon and you can find it there.
And you're also a senior research fellow
At the Global Policy Institute, yeah,
the
that's
Global
right.
Policy Institute. And you're currently based in Hungary.
Currently in Budapest, yeah.
Okay. Thank you again for talking to me. I think it was quite a good, productive discussion, and look forward to doing it again soon.
Look forward to it.
Thanks, George.
Thank you.